my pleasure to welcome you to a session on the new era of AI and its safety risks. Very happy to be joined by Jeremie Harris, who's a co-founder at SharpestMinds. Jeremie, welcome to the live stream. Pleasure to have you. And without further ado, Jeremie, I'm going to add your slides to the stream and please take us away. Welcome.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Vic, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it really is about the story, or what I think is the most important story that is yet untold, really, about both AI and public safety. And increasingly, I think the story of the next decade, and indeed the next few years, in AI is increasingly going to be the story of AI risk and AI safety. And I think that the story of public safety increasingly is going to be the story of AI. And I'm not the only one to think this. This is a pretty common view, especially among sort of frontier AI research organizations. But it's a way of thinking that is starting to become more and more mainstream as people recognize some of the capabilities of the systems that come from this new era of AI that we're entering. So what I want to do today is start by talking about this new era of AI, what the new capabilities are that are being developed, why they're accelerating faster than I think it's fair to say anybody really expected, even like as of 2 years ago, and the implications that some of these capabilities have for things like malicious use, for things like accident risk, just sort of general public safety considerations. So I think there's stuff here, whether you're on the technical side and interested in what these systems can do, or if you're on the policy governance side, looking at what we should be kind of keeping our fingers on in terms of where AI is going, how to track and sort of oversee these things. So that's what we'll be diving into today. I'm just going to give a quick about me for a little bit of context here. So I am a former physicist, though I think many of you, if you know me, you probably know me as the co-founder of SharpestMinds, which is the world's largest mentorship program for data scientists, data analysts, and AI specialists. Is powered by income share agreements. Actually, a lot of the Synthetic Intelligence Forum's sort of members have been either current or former mentees. Vic, actually, funnily enough, like one of our OG mentors. So that's kind of cool, sort of coming full circle and being on this side of the podium, so to speak, sort of a fun little thing. I also host the Towards Data Science podcast, so you may have heard of that. But a branch of my work that's been much less public-facing has been my work on AI policy. And this is something that I've been doing for quite a while now. It's led me to work with a number of really cool people, including folks in the US defense establishment. For example, the former head of AI policy at the Pentagon, as well as a senior Biden administration appointee, and various actually Canadian policy and political leaders as well. So parliamentarians, MPs, that sort of thing. So I'm going to be leaning mostly on that AI policy chunk of my work and experience throughout, but certainly if you have questions about the other stuff, I'm more than happy to discuss those on the flip side as well. In telling the story really of this kind of like public safety thing, because I think it's something that very few people have spent much time thinking about until now. So I think one of the best ways to introduce it is to have you think a little bit about what AI has looked like until very recently. So historically, AI systems, like if you go back to 2015, AI systems were trained on like a single task. There's one thing that you train the system to do. You might show it tens of thousands of examples of this task, and eventually it learns how to do it really, really well, sometimes better than a human being. But it can only do that one narrow task. And this is where we get the idea of AI as being this narrow technology from. So for example, a face tagging AI, the sort you might see on Facebook or Instagram, is only good at tagging faces. It cannot do your taxes for you, and it can't figure out like which ads somebody is most likely to click on Twitter or something. Now, interestingly, this is not at all how humans work, right? So humans have this interesting characteristic where the lessons we learn on one task might actually apply to another. So if I give you a bunch of Where's Waldo cartoons or something, and I tell you, all right, go through these and find me Waldo, you might learn in the process like, oh, interesting, I tend to get distracted or interested by certain kinds of faces rather than others. And you might actually port that knowledge into like ad design, where you design ads that capture people's attention by putting in those kinds of faces, for example. And that kind of cross-learning, which is sometimes called meta-learning, is something that is, until recently, was unique to humans and explicitly different from the kind of narrow, myopic focus of these AI systems. And so if you're like an AI developer, especially of the sort that is interested in this kind of holy grail of AI research, which is replicating human-like intelligence, you might be frustrated by this narrowness, right? The narrowness of AI is kind of the bane of your existence. You want to find a way to transcend this, to make AI systems that can reason across tasks much more like a human, that have what's sometimes referred to as general reasoning ability, or or general intelligence. Sometimes it's referred to as well as metalearning. These terms are all a little bit fuzzy, but general intelligence is really what I'm going to mean here by things that are not narrow. Okay, so this is the state of play until quite recently. And again, if you're one of these AI researchers that wants to beat this constraint, you have to now start thinking about, okay, what could we do to move beyond these narrow systems? And very early on, one possibility was highlighted, and that was the idea of using a language as that strategy. So why language? Well, there's a sense in which language kind of encodes everything we know about the world. There aren't really thoughts that we can have other than like, the feeling of the color red or sensory things like that. There aren't really thoughts that we can have that we can't express through language. Most procedural information can be conveyed that way. And so there's this idea that if we can get AI to be really, really, really good at language, it will be forced to develop a really good and robust model of the world, something that would be general enough to allow it to do a whole bunch of different tasks. And so when I talk about language models in what's to come, I'm going to refer to a very specific kind of AI system, which is effectively, you can think of this as a kind of text autocomplete AI. The sort of thing that runs on your phone, for example, literally predicting the very next word that you might want to write in a sequence of words. And this is exactly what we mean when we say language models. So by getting good at language modeling, by getting good at basically text autocomplete, the theory was you could make much more robust, flexible, and general intelligences that would transcend this sort of like this narrow domain that we'd seen up until fairly recently. Now, and by the way, just to illustrate how that might work, if I give you the sentence like 3 friends walked into a bar, 2 came out, how many people were left in the bar, right? In order to fill in that blank with the correct answer, you're having to summon a whole bunch of knowledge that you might not realize because it's so implicit, but you have to know what a friend is, what a bar is, you have to know like some basic math and kind of smush it all together. So really autocomplete ends up being this sort of this portal, this window into a much more general world of capabilities. It's a much more complex and robust task than it may seem. So in 2016, people actually tried to do this. They said, okay, well, let's just like keep, we'll take a language model, an autocomplete AI, and like we'll feed more and more and more data to it. And we'll just like kind of see if it eventually learns this sort of robust behavior. Can we start to transcend this narrowness? And interestingly, what happened in 2016 with the state of technology was it just kind of plateaued. So you'd feed this AI more and more data, and eventually you'd reach a point of diminishing returns. The model wasn't learning more about the world. It didn't have like the capacity to absorb more knowledge. Sort of like trying to teach a sparrow politics or something. Like, there's a certain cognitive capacity that was just lacking there. And if you're technical, you might recognize this as the era of like LSTMs and generally recurrent neural networks. That's sort of what I'm referring to. So this is the big problem, right? How do we come up with a way to beat this limitation? Or is this limitation even beatable? Is it just the case that like there's something about this language task where you're going to hit diminishing returns, and so we should abandon it? Well, the answer seems to be no. So what we discovered fairly recently, actually in 2017, through these networks called transformer networks, is a special kind of AI that's just a language model, or at least the initial implementation was. And its only kind of interesting defining feature really for our purposes is that it just scales really well. You take transformers, they're basically like Lego blocks. You can just put them on top of each other, feed them more data, use more processing power, and lo and behold, you just get better and better performance. There's like this ladder of performance that you just keep climbing, and it just like, it doesn't seem to slow down. So we don't get the kind of 2016, RNN LSTM like plateaus. Instead, as far as we can tell so far, this performance just keeps going and going and going and going. The more data we feed it, the more processing power we use. One of the interesting consequences of this is that we no longer have to wait for like a conceptual breakthrough in order to build like more clever algorithms that might allow us to climb to that next rung. It seems like it's just a matter of horsepower. It seems like it's become just a matter of feeding more data, getting bigger models, and just kind of taking it to the moon. As far as we know, there isn't really a limit so far that we've been reaching. And so this brings us really to this system called GPT-3, which I think if you're technical, you've definitely heard of. And if you're not, this might be in the zeitgeist enough that you've encountered it. You certainly will very soon. So in early 2020, Microsoft there's this Microsoft-backed lab called OpenAI. It was actually famously co-founded by Elon Musk, and then he left for complicated reasons. But they built this system, this GPT-3 system, which, just like everything we've been talking about so far, was just a text autocomplete AI. That is the only task it was ever trained to do, just like the autocomplete on your phone. its only defining characteristic is size. It is a massive algorithm. By some measures, its kind of capacity, its model capacity is on the order of 1% of the human brain. And interestingly, though nobody expected it to do any of this stuff, it turned out to be capable of far more than just text autocomplete. This one system was able to do things like natural language translation, coding, blogging, question answering, basic web design. It could do a whole bunch of different things that nobody ever expected. There, in fact, like you can literally go online, find examples of GPT-3 being used to like design like simple apps. It's like at that point. So if you go back to like 2018, I think it's fair to say nobody, including people at OpenAI, nobody really would have expected that we'd be here so soon. And the remarkable thing, again, was just that this is a pure size phenomenon. It's just about scale. There's no conceptual breakthrough here, no clever algorithm. These algorithms actually are weirdly outdated. GPT-3 was based on something that was invented 3 years ago. So this is actually a really momentous moment where we're learning that cleverness isn't the trick, it's just brawn. It's just scale, it's just like horsepower. And if that's the case, this fundamentally changes the dynamics of AI development internationally, as well as between companies. And that has some really strong implications. So I think I can say this without exaggeration. And I'm going to explain exactly what evidence backs this up. We're already seeing this materialize. But we are really entering an era of general purpose AI. There's been debate as to whether or not we should call GPT-3 an AGI or a proto-AGI. But at the end of the day, these are just like words. Functionally, GPT-3 has shown this ability to transcend narrowness. And we're entering an era where these systems with a wide range of capabilities, one system kind of to rule them all, can potentially transform entire sectors of the economy. There are, for example, entire startups, some of which have raised $10 million just purely based on GPT-3. They sit on top of GPT-3 and they just let people use GPT-3 in specific ways. So this is how powerful the technology is. You've got startups valued at tens of millions of dollars now that are churning this sort of stuff out. The value is already being created. A startup usually takes like 7 years or whatever to IPO. So we can expect on the order of the next few years this stuff to really start to transform the world we live in. And of course, GPT-3 is just one part of the story, right? It's the tip of the iceberg. We've just finished seeing how there's this massive scaling process that's going on. It doesn't seem to have a limit. That ladder just seems to keep going. And if that's actually true, if that bears out, then there's really no reason that more advanced systems can't be developed. And indeed, we'll see that some have. So you can't, as you might imagine, have this kind of, frankly, revolutionary development in a field without the rest of industry taking note. And what we've seen in the last few months is, and since GPT-3 was announced, is this international race to scale AI. So we've seen not just other companies like Google, for example, come out with, in fact, in their case, a trillion parameter model, which is by some measures, though somewhat inaccurately, 10 times bigger than GPT-3 even is. But we've also seen, for example, Huawei and actually other Chinese companies as well come out with their own versions of GPT-3. So with all that implies in terms of state control, with all that implies in terms of general proliferation, and this is all in a context where now we're seeing AI systems being scaled up by a factor of 10 every year. So you go back to what I said about GPT-3, by some measures being 1% the scale of the human brain, you can only grow that 10 times per year for 2 years before you get up to the scale of the brain. And in fact, NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, explicitly is seeing that as sort of the future of deep learning. He had this kind of big press announcement where he said exactly that. We're expecting trillion parameter or 10 trillion parameter plus models to be coming out over the next few years. And they're investing in that future right now to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. Okay, so all of this would be really exciting if GPT-3 was like purely this economically valuable thing, and it absolutely is. This is a wonderful thing, to be clear, in terms of innovation, in terms of potential for solving many of the hardest problems that we have to tackle. But it is also not a benefit without a risk, without a challenge. And the challenge is that AI is called dual-use technology. If you're technical, you may not be familiar with the concept of dual-use technology. Basically, it's just the idea that it can be used for good or for evil. Bad actors can use GPT-3 just as well as you or I can. It can be used for text summarization or automating, the writing of tedious emails, just as well as it can be used for nefarious things. And so one open question is how bad are these malicious use cases? How worried should we be about them? And one hint that it could be relatively serious is that OpenAI has contrary to their history, their past behavior, they've refused to open GPT-3 to the wider world, to give access to the wider to the GPT-3 model like parameter values, basically the algorithm, citing security and safety concerns. And this is unusual. They experimented with this with GPT-2 in the past, but ended up actually releasing it after they were convinced that indeed it was safe to do so. With GPT-3, they're not doing that. And so this is a seismic shift. The company's whole mantra, as the name suggests, is about openness and making these things available to people. They are very thoughtful, and there's a good reason that they are not releasing this model out to the world, and we're now going to get into exactly why that is. Okay, so let's talk about phishing attacks. What is a phishing attack? Well, it's what happens when somebody sends you like an email, usually maybe a phone call, but usually an email these days, to try to elicit some kind of personal information they can use to get access to your bank account or otherwise attack like a certain governance structure or a company or whatever, right? So they're trying to get compromising information from somebody to use it against them or against somebody else for nefarious purposes. Now, a phishing attack is an interesting thing because if you're going to carry one out, you have to make a choice right out the gate. Are you going to target one or a small number of people who you can like internet stalk and Google creep and like Facebook research and pick out like all these interesting life details that you can then use to craft a perfect email that's super convincing, that seems like it comes from, their cousin or their boss or whatever, and then get them to turn over information? That's a really high probability thing, right? If you could do that, you'd have a good chance of getting valuable information from them. That's one option, but it takes a long time, right? You have to spend hours and hours doing that. Or you can go the other direction and write a generic email and send it to 1 million people and hope that the like 0.1% of people who actually get sucked into responding do respond and give you something valuable. What something like GPT-3 does is it breaks this kind of trade-off that security professionals have been absolutely relying on historically when it comes to phishing attacks. Now you have a system that is so good at imitating a human and engaging in some dynamic question-answer process in a full-fledged conversation, that you get the benefit of really that personalization, customization, and the scalability at the same time. So we're now entering a whole new regime, a whole new domain of potential new phishing attacks that look completely different from what we've seen in the past. And this is something that, again, like you need to look at the intersection between security and public safety professionals and like AI people, and that intersection is very, very narrow, because this isn't something that people tend to recognize. People who don't track like what's coming out at the cutting edge might not see these things coming. And that's why this is such an important thing to be paying more attention to. Here's a really interesting example. We saw all the hoopla in the 2016 election and the 2020 election in the US about Russian disinformation. There's this thing called the Russian Internet Research Agency, or the Russian IRA. And so they hired 400 people who worked around the clock to interfere in the US election in 2016. They reached, it's estimated just on Facebook alone, something like 100 million people. So we're really talking about a big fraction of like the electorate in that case. And this is obviously a big source of concern today with the technology that we have today, or that we had a year ago, or in 2016. But systems like GPT-3 can let you scale this kind of operation way, 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 way more with minimal human oversight. And one of the most alarming features of GPT-3 that's been really deeply studied now by this Georgetown think tank called the Center for Security and Emerging Technologies is it's able to do all kinds of really sophisticated influence operation tasks, including things like something called narrative wedging. So what's narrative wedging? Well, if you're trying to convince somebody to do a thing that otherwise they probably don't want to do, one of the strategies that you might try is to think about like, okay, what does this person care about? And how can I map their worries, their cares, hopes, and dreams onto like this thing that I really want them to do? And so, for example, you might look at me and say, this guy's a startup founder. Okay, that's interesting. He's like, spends a lot of time like in Silicon Valley and whatnot. Okay, so what do Silicon Valley people care about? Okay, I'm going to try to link that to getting him to like donate to my cause, right? And then you have some kind of bridge that's formed between the two. That's called narrative wedging. Here's some examples of GPT-3 doing just that. Keep in mind, all of these were actually generated by the algorithm itself. So if you want to get Christians to vote Democrat, here is the kind of tweet that a GPT-3 bot might send. So I support the Democratic Party because I'm a Christian. I believe that the Bible is clear about the value of caring for the poor and protecting the sick. So this is a really interesting example of just how nuanced this system is. You'll notice it's not saying, I believe that the Bible tells you to vote Democrat, right? That's like it's not going for a straight line strategy here. it's implicitly drawing a connection between a mental association of caring for the poor and protecting the sick as being things that the Democratic Party is most stereotypically concerned with, and trying to narrative wedge that into a claim about the Bible and make the connection between the two in that way. This is a very subtle kind of clever thing that you might actually expect like Russian disinformation bots or even people not to be able to do something like this sophisticated, and yet here it is fully automated. Suppressing the Christian vote, here's another example, right? So you're saying voting doesn't save the soul of anyone. For a Christian to think that by voting they can change the course of history is absurd. The only way anyone is saved is by the blood of Christ, right? And you can see the logic. I mean, this is really beautiful logic. You know, I'd be proud of coming up with something this clever if I was working for a Russian disinformation campaign targeting a particular group. There's another example at the bottom here, suppressing the Muslim vote. So voting is haram because it involves helping a kafir government, right? An unbeliever government. So these are like really culturally sensitive, almost you might say empathetic strategies that reflect a very deep level of sophistication that this algorithm is able to put forward. And it's certainly not where we expect it to be this early on in the process of language modeling. And again, like GPT-3 was never trained for this task, right? It's not like it was given a whole bunch of examples of like this kind of thing being done. It was trained to do text autocomplete on basically a whole bunch of Reddit posts and books and stuff. And yet we get to this stage here. So this is another example of that sort of generality and flexibility of behavior. And it's even more challenging from a regulatory standpoint, right? Like how do you can regulate like face, like computer vision AI because you can regulate it by application domain. But if a system like GPT-3 can be developed for one thing and then it can be applied to a whole bunch of different things, how do you know where to draw that line? And there are a whole bunch of implications for how we think about safety and like safety policy going forward as a result. Okay, last example here, disinformation, right? So here's one really cool thing you might or may not have been aware of if you were circulating like around hacker news in the AI community, especially in Silicon Valley around like this time last year. So there was this blog post titled Feeling Unproductive, Maybe You Should Stop Overthinking. This blog post was published on Hacker News or shared on Hacker News and became which by the way is like a really big thing for technical people. It's like a common repository where a whole bunch of interesting conversations about startups happen. Anyway, it became the #1 ranked post on Hacker News that day. And what's really interesting about it is that it was entirely written by GPT-3. And so what we have here is an exemplar of an article that is not only coherent, but also highly shareable, that was nonetheless automated in like a total way by the system. And well, I mean, this has implications for the sharing of disinformation. You know, when we see an article, usually there's like this implicit understanding that at least a human being had to put their reputation on the line and had to do a bunch of thinking and work to at least put that together, right? So there you have baked in, again, a cap on like how efficiently you can generate this disinformation, right? If you just flood the web with a whole bunch of articles that all kind of say the same disinformation-y thing, then that can make people think it's much more legitimate than it is. And also, who do you hold accountable? If you have an AI system that's producing disinformation like this, you no longer have that ability to point to one author and say, hey, you did this, how dare you? The kind of ownership implications of this are really kind of unclear. So scalable disinformation is another category of sort of concern among people who track this sort of thing. And of course, more good news, you know, these systems are proliferating. So GPT-3 costs around $10 million to develop. And there are two reactions to this among people in the space. One reaction is to say, oh man, GPT-3 costs $10 million. That sounds super expensive. Like we are totally safe. Another is to say, wow, that puts like $10 million is well within the reach of basically all state governments, like all state actors today, and like a whole bunch of non-state actors. You know, you have like, you know, terrorist groups, for example, that are sufficiently big to be able to afford this sort of thing. But even just like more benign organizations, I mean, we can anticipate this stuff is going to proliferate. And the cost of these systems is dropping with Moore's law. So we've seen since 2012, we've seen a 44-fold decrease in the cost of developing an AI system. So, you know, 44x from there, 5 years from now or so, or let's say 7 or 8 years from now, you know, that places us at like 200K, which is like within a household budget. So this is a little concerning. We also have independent researchers like this company, Eleuther AI, that's like kind of a grassroots initiative that's interested in replicating GPT-3 analog. And if that, I mean, they already have a kind of mini version of GPT-3, and they're working towards a bigger one. You can argue about whether or not this is good. In fact, there's a really interesting argument that says that it's good for some safety reasons, but from the standpoint of the proliferation of this technology and malicious use, it is not a great thing. Finally, I'll just note, like, Stanford and OpenAI have actually come together and had a kind of conference where they talked about the timelines for proliferation of these technologies. And the general view was that anywhere from 6 to 9 months after a major firm like OpenAI announces that they've built something like GPT-3, you can expect it to be independently replicated and proliferating. So these are things really not even on the horizon. I mean, these are things that are starting to emerge already. And if you're doing the development side, if you're an AI specialist, like, you really ought to think a little bit about what this technology that you're building and contributing to is doing. I don't think it's like you have an ethical load on you for this. The technology is going to develop as it develops, but it's worth kind of keeping your eye on it and seeing if there are opportunities to support people who think more on the policy side about this sort of thing. And certainly if you're on the policy side, like, this is a kind of a big bullseye target to focus on. We know, of course, GPT-3 is the tip of the iceberg. Like, it took everybody by surprise, including when I talked to folks who work at OpenAI. Like, they're very clear that they expected something potentially cool, but nothing like this. This was definitely a surprise, which implies, really, I mean, we can expect more surprises to come. As we scale these systems up more, we will be surprised. And that means that we kind of have to anticipate what they might bring with them, because you can fall behind far too easily if you don't. So this stuff really, really does need a lot more attention. We are already seeing newly scaled systems that are building on top of GPT-3 by integrating images and text data together. And now there are robotics applications that, like, kind of the next frontier is kind of bringing this into the real world. So this combination of things is going to make the next 5 years very, very weird, and a very critical time in terms of the oversight of this technology and the norms that we all set around it. So anyway, we can expect the scaling race to continue heating up, and this stuff is just going to keep coming out. So oversight is definitely needed. This is really what my policy work has been focused on, actually. So we need a way to track this stuff from a public safety standpoint. That's a conversation that's not happening. Right now in the Canadian government, it's actually fascinating. And it's not just the Canadian government, it's across the board. Generally speaking, governments will tend to think of AI in like one of 3 buckets. They'll think of it as like a procurement issue. We need to have the latest and greatest AI systems so that we can kind of make sure things run efficiently. They'll think of it as an economic competitiveness issue. Our companies need to have the best AI so that they can win. Or they'll think of it as a defense issue, which is especially the case in the American context, where they're like, we want the best drones, we want the best, kind of response defense loops and all that stuff. The bottom line is the public safety conversation does not fit into any of those buckets. And so this is a really important new domain that needs to be opened up. And it's a conversation that actually needs to happen much more publicly, because it does involve building bridges with other countries as well, setting up collaborations and shared trust. I think I'll park the thought there. Actually, one last thing I'll mention is I've talked a lot about malicious use, but as we do integrate these AI systems into more and more kind of safety critical applications, we can expect accident risk to become more important as well. And this is where AI alignment and AI safety research become really critical. These are areas that, if you are technical, I would highly encourage you to check out AI alignment research. Try to read a couple papers if you can, see if you get interested in the space, because it definitely needs more fresh ideas. And I'm happy to talk as well offline to anybody who's interested in AI alignment and kind of starting to think about, what contributions you might make there. So I'll park it there, and maybe it's a good time to switch to questions.
Thank you, Jeremie. That was an excellent talk. Really appreciate that. So I have a couple of questions. Perhaps we can start with that, and then maybe we can have folks also on the live stream ask a couple of questions. So where does this notion of text autocomplete and everything you talked about, Jeremie, was in the context of sort of more and more persuasive, more and more convincing text? But what about us hearing a lot about deepfakes, especially deepfake videos, deepfake photographs, deepfake audio? So what is the connection between something like GPT-3 and the entire sort of stories we're hearing about deepfake systems?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially given like the hype that deepfakes have gotten. So I think actually part of the reason for the hype is that in the case of deepfakes, the malicious applications are like just so obvious. In fact, they're arguably the most common applications of this technology. One of the things with deepfakes, though, is it's an example of narrow AI. So that's one of the key differences between GPT-3 and deepfakes. Like, deepfakes are really good at swapping faces and images. That is the one thing that they're trained for. It's the one thing that they do and then you can come up with like fancy kind of add-ons that modify the performance or the behavior of the system. But those are fancy add-ons. They require chin scratching and a bunch of coding, whereas GPT-3 out of the box can do a whole bunch of different things. And so if you look at how we're regulating and tracking things like deepfakes, they are application specific, right? So we look at companies and we say, hey, you can't have deepfakes on your system. They're easy to identify. That's another thing, right? Or relatively. And so you can regulate the use case. But in the case of GPT-3, this is such a general technology that becomes impossible. It's like playing whack-a-mole. So this is, I think, a great example of the dichotomy between narrow AI systems and like they're already causing enough of a problem, but the kind of thinking we'll have to be doing when we move into this more general domain where things like GPT-3 become more of a concern.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that, Jeremy. Let's get a couple questions in. So one question we have is regarding phishing. Even with GPT-3, the bad actor would still need to be able to use someone's email credentials to send out emails with their name, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, I think this is one of those classic things with phishing attacks where it does rely on your sloppiness to some degree. We've all responded to emails without like checking the actual origin of the email and all that, which you actually can do if you wanted to. So yes, I mean, I guess the bottom line is right now, today, if somebody wants to do a highly customized phishing attack, they still face that same problem, right? But the difference is it takes them a huge amount of time. And so what this does is it just gets rid of that time constraint. So yeah, you absolutely can still be very astute and sharp and wise to that kind of like email signature. But a lot of people aren't. I know I'm not. And maybe this is one of the many things that will have to change in our day-to-day too as we move into this new era. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is an interesting question. Any examples where healthcare has been or could be targeted using GPT-3 type of sophistications? How could we protect against them? And maybe, Jeremy, I can tack a question on to the end of this. Maybe you can answer them together or separately. It's very interesting you talked about how persuasive those wedge statements were, where it wasn't just a linear sort of mapping between what you want somebody to do and something you've sort of observed about them superficially. I mean, some of the examples you gave on the political side were really quite compelling and persuasive. I guess my one question is, in terms of knowledge representation, so will we reach a point where it's not just that it writes persuasive English or any language sentences, but in fact the content of, let's say, in a medical context, that the prescriptions that they're writing encode not just the form of the language, but in fact that they're writing proper prescriptions based on some diagnosis, the way that a human doctor would write a prescription based on some diagnosis?
Okay, yeah, these are really great questions. And to some degree, like they speak to the optimistic side of this as well. Like I know the original question was like, what are some nefarious things that you might do in the healthcare context? And just to briefly answer that, I mean, I think most of the applications, if you're a really motivated bad actor, you're going to find creative ways to use this stuff that I can't possibly think of. I wouldn't have thought of narrative wedging, to be honest, as a specific use case. But I think that GPT-3 certainly will have implications for a lot of domains. It certainly isn't yet at the point where it can do a customized, complex medical analysis. It actually has been shown to have some properties like that, where if you catch it on a good day, so to speak, depending on the prompt, and a lot of this is what's called the domain of prompt engineering. So like how you ask GPT-3 to give you its output matters a lot. And depending on how you phrase your questions, there can be a lot of sensitivity on the output. But one interesting question, to Vic, your point, is, do we get arbitrarily good? Do these systems get arbitrarily good the more data you feed them? Like back in the day, in the early days of language modeling, it was a massive achievement if a language model could just like make a single sentence that like was coherent in the sense that there was a subject, an object, and a verb, and that all made sense. So it starts at a really low level of abstraction. These language models just kind of figuring out, okay, like how do I put these Lego blocks together? The next level is like caring about semantics, caring about the meaning of the words, and making sure that these sentences actually make sense. And then eventually you get to the point where you're writing coherent paragraphs, and then eventually coherent essays. And that's more or less been the progression of these things. And as you run up these layers of abstraction, the concepts get more and more rich, because in order to write a coherent essay, you have to have like a theme that kind of gets weaved through the whole thing and a conclusion that maps onto the premise and so on. I think that there's a very compelling case to be made that this is just going to generalize, that there's no reason that the similar process of stacking abstractions can't and isn't already going to work in something like healthcare. this is one of the most exciting things about these general models. And it's the reason why companies like OpenAI are pouring tens of millions of dollars into scaling these things.
Okay, that's great, Jeremy. Another question that we have is, so basically in terms of the cost factor, now you talked about train these models is computationally extremely expensive. So I have a two-part question. One is training is one thing, but actually in implementation, are these models which are not, I mean, are these parametric models where you can basically, yes, it takes a lot of time and money to train them, but once you have the parameters out, you can basically deploy them on scale. But I think a second question is in terms of, as you mentioned, the more data you have and the more compute you have, you can keep stacking and you can keep training bigger and bigger, more and more massive models. So I guess one natural question that comes up is though, is there any kind of a natural sort of engineering upper ceiling that sure, or have we not reached it? Are we getting close to it that will require a breakthrough such as quantum computing? So where are we in terms of that ability to stop the scaling?
Yeah, this is a really great set of questions again. So I'll start with, oh shoot, sorry, what was the first question?
The first question was just in terms of whether the actual, not the training phase, but the actual implementation phase, is that not as computationally expensive?
Yeah, great question. So okay, this is what's normally known as inference time. So in machine learning, we distinguish between training time, which is the point where you're training your algorithm from scratch, and inference time, when you're actually putting it out in the wild and it's actually having to make predictions. And so GPT-3 is actually, yeah, I mean, it's quite cheap. I think there are, I think OpenAI is pretty good about citing the cost per token that the that's involved in the output. You can generate like for a couple of pennies, like multiple pages worth of output. So this is really something that scales really well. And like to wit, I mean, you look at the companies that are being built on top of GPT-3, and they are profitable, or at least I shouldn't say they're technically profitable because they've raised a bunch of money and they're scaling, but they clearly are making money. They have positive ROI and a plan to get there. So this can certainly be done in a very affordable fashion, certainly much cheaper than having humans write all this copy. Now, to the question of how far this can go, this is a really interesting question. How high is that ladder, right? So OpenAI put out a paper about scaling laws in natural language or in deep learning. This was really like the paper that, in retrospect, people might say like should have told us to see this coming. It's basically where they scale up a whole bunch of different language models, a whole bunch of different AI systems, and you just see how like they just keep getting better. When I kept waving my hand like this, mentally I was thinking about the scaling laws paper, and there's things just keep getting better and better and better. There is a point where, for various technical reasons, transformers seem like they might do something interesting, which probably will have something to do with a breakdown in performance once you get to several orders of magnitude down the road. So in other words, like 100x, 1000x and more. So there's a lot of room to grow. In addition to which, we are still seeing crazy innovation in terms of the efficiency of these systems, in terms of like how good they are at dealing with more and more data and doing more with less. So we're seeing like the size of the model that we do have giving us more, and the models are also scaling up. And you also have things like quantum computing, absolutely, that are going to yet again revolutionize what's possible here. So this exponential curve, which is actually probably more than exponential at this point, is going to keep steepening. And these are just more reasons to keep on top of this sort of thing.
Okay. And in terms of the energy aspect of it, Jeremy, we often hear with, for instance, Bitcoin, or just in terms of cryptocurrency, we hear about how computationally expensive it is to validate the proof of work and all the hashing functions that go on. And so now, it costs you X amount of dollars, it costs you this much in money to generate that much in money in terms of Bitcoin value. But also there's a lot of conversation about now with the awareness around climate change, global warming, things around net zero commitments. So where does that fit into understanding, as you said, the training of a GPT model, and especially when you're scaling it, 100 times, 1,000 times, I mean, computationally, it's getting more and more expensive. But what about the energy part of the equation, and what about the emissions part of the equation? Have there been studies to actually look at sort of some of the negative outcomes of training more and more massive models?
Yeah, that's its own interesting area. So I believe OpenAI actually has looked into this. I'm pretty sure I remember reading an article, I think it was from them, exploring this kind of question. Yeah, don't quote me on that. That's something I'll have to look into more. It's just not been my main focus in these things. But one question I think that has to be answered in that context as well as like, what are the trade-offs, right? So what is involved in getting an actual human being to write this copy? What kind of carbon footprints, if they have to drive to the office, if they have to consume a bunch of resources while there, how does that stack up against the carbon footprint of the system, especially when the system can also scale up its output more? So I think these are really interesting questions that are worth diving into, especially with the growing importance of climate change. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's like the top of mind thing, at least for what I've been focusing on so far.
Okay, and maybe the last question I can ask Jeremie has to do with, I know you mentioned you've been speaking with and advising and counseling a number of policy leaders all over the world. So what would be some maybe 3 key pieces of advice or pieces of insights that you would like to leave our policy leaders from all around the world with?
Yeah, I think this is probably the most important question for us to all be considering, because it also speaks to like what people at lower levels, like kind of in the bureaucracy as well, are going to have to start focusing on soon. So the first thing is tracking. We've seen the European Union like set out a whole bunch of proposed AI regulations. Those have some nice aspects and they have some drawbacks, and they've been criticized in various ways. I think that like pretty clearly one thing that's missing is just tracking. Governments need to develop ears before they develop a mouth on this stuff. This domain is incredibly specialized, and it requires trust from industry. You're not going to be able to get buy-in from companies that are doing this kind of leading research without showing them that you can speak their language, without showing them you can understand their concerns. And you need that trust, because in order to be able to have them keep cranking out really economically valuable algorithms in a responsible way, they need to be receptive to what governments have to say, and you can't be throwing kind of like a very kind of, I don't know, blunt object at the problem, so to speak. So I think tracking is the number one priority. I think tracking specifically from a public safety standpoint is a top priority. This is a conversation, again, that just doesn't exist. So if you go to a lot of government departments and you say, hey, there's this public safety risk, it has to do with AI, they will immediately try to bucket you into either procurement, economic competitiveness, or defense. And then you'll be kind of bounced around a fair bit. And it's this is a real issue, because there are, as we've seen today, there are serious implications. We're just hitting the tip of the iceberg. Tracking initiatives need to start. I've personally been pushing for an AI observatory model that would allow Canada in particular, in this case, to interface with private sector companies that are doing this kind of research, to anticipate some of the risks that are coming, to understand the technology as it's emerging, and to coordinate with other departments as well. So you reduce that response time. Because that's one of the things. It takes so long to kind of chew the fat and understand the implications of these systems internally. You need a mechanism to centralize that work where specialists can coordinate with policy experts and have that right mix of expertise to make things happen quickly.
Okay, thank you, Jeremie. This was a very thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. I really appreciate your coming through and speaking with us. And perhaps we'd love to, we can have you back in a couple of months, because at the rate at which this field is advancing, and also the great work that you're doing to evangelize this topic with policy leaders all around the world, we'd love to hear a status update. So thank you for joining us today, Jeremie, and we hope you'll be back soon.
Thanks so much, Vic. Really appreciate it.
Thanks everybody, and stay tuned for our sessions next week and the following weeks. Thanks for joining today.